Bring in my political panel this afternoon. Two people who know a bit about these issues. Labor's Ed Husic and Liberal MP Tim Wilson join me. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Tim, I'll start with you. Malcolm Turnbull has accused the Liberal Party of being influenced by climate change denialists, a group of climate change denialists. Is that the case?
Well, of course, we always have a diversity of views within the Liberal Party. That's kind of the nature of actually being part of a liberal democracy and being a Liberal Party, is you don't require a uniformity of view. It's a member of a political party that if you stand up and speak out and hold a different view, you get expelled. That's the nature of it.
And you cut New Start payments.
And so we are actually a party that respects every diversity of opinions. One of the reasons why I've always been a big supporter of free speech is because the only way you can persuade people to change their opinion or change their mind is to take them on a journey from where they are to where you want to be.
OK, Tim, you say that, but diversity of opinion, what happens when the opinion isn't based on any fact?
Well, there are lots of opinions that aren't always necessarily based on fact. People are entitled to their view. As somebody who has long argued around the importance of confronting reducing our greenhouse gas emissions while delivering reliable and affordable energy, I want to make sure that we're having that conversation so that we can take not just to take the Australian community with us.
Do you have some sympathy, though, Tim Wilson, to some of the arguments that Malcolm Turnbull is making, that the collapse of the National Energy Guarantee has led to problems with pricing and with dealing with this broader issue around energy?
The challenge that we face around energy is that, for the most part, the levers sit actually with state governments. It's not what we designed. That's how it was set up from 1901 with the Constitution. And our task has been to set targets that we can meet, and we have done that, and then to seek to implement as much policy within our scope of responsibility and influence, which we are doing, but also to make sure that states live up to their bargain and both deliver reliable and affordable energy while cutting our greenhouse gas emissions and not leaving Australians behind.
Now, we're seeing protests this week from this group, Extinction Rebellion. Ed Husic, on those protests that are taking place across the country, do you think the penalties are adequate for those protesters, or do you want to see protesters, as suggested by the Home Affairs Minister, lose welfare payments or face a tougher stick, if you like, as a result of their protesting?
Firstly, I think if you are going to raise your concerns, you need to do it in a way that is commonsensical, and you obey the law and you make sure that your points aren't undermined by a failure to do so. And I think that there will be a lot of people that want to take to the streets, as we've seen recently, expressing their frustration that an issue that they care deeply about and that they know longer term will have an impact on the quality of lives of so many, and that is the issue of climate change and the way that we respond to it. These will happen more and more, and we can't have them undermined, that force of people power undermined by those who want to do differently. As for Peter Dutton, and coming back to Tim Wilson's point earlier, it appears that you can express an opinion as long as the government's happy with it, and if you're not doing so, they'll use other forms to clamp down on you, as we've seen with Peter Dutton, as we've seen with Michaelia Cash. But I don't want to go away from the other point that you questioned Tim on, if you don't mind, Patricia, which is about Malcolm Turnbull's comments. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull's comments are right. I mean, the only thing that appears to come out of the coalition party room, the only thing that the coalition seems to be able to generate is higher power prices and higher emissions. But, I really wish that the leadership that Malcolm Turnbull is exhibiting now was exhibited when he was in a position to do something about it, when we were ready to work with him on the neg. If he'd put that legislation to the floor of Parliament that would have given the levers that Tim Wilson just talked about to be able to see us generate power more efficiently and cleanly and also reduce emissions. That should have happened.
So, Tim Wilson, on those proposals that were floated by the Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton, there was a range of them, mandatory sentencing, even tougher penalties, but also these protesters losing welfare payments. Do you support any of those ideas?
Well, I'd have to go back and review everything he said.
I gave you three.
No, but the fundamental principle of what the Home Affairs Minister said is, and under our mutual obligation system, is if you're going to receive welfare, then the expectation that you seek out and apply for roles, and I agree with that.
Yeah, but
the basis.
So presumably Centrelink's checking and they're doing it.
And if they're not doing that and they're using protesting as an excuse for that, then they're giving up their component of the mutual responsibility network. Otherwise, the principle remains that people are entitled to protest in Australia so long as they obey the law and they don't inhibit the rights and freedoms of other people. And that's the basis in which the Liberal Party and myself have always argued for free freedom of speech and freedom of association, and of course the right for people to protest.
So if they're fulfilling their obligations, and you presume they are, or there's already penalties built into the system, should they keep their welfare?
Well, as far as I'm aware, that's the basis of which anyone who's argued this point has argued, and so I don't see why there would be any additional measures.
Well, no, the ideas that were put to Peter Dutton and have been addressed by other MPs since are actually additional. They're not just about using the existing
Well, I support the current law.
OK, so you don't think it should be strengthened or beefed up?
Well, I have yet to see any substantial proposal. I've got people saying they don't like when protesters interfere in other people living their lives and exercising their rights and freedoms. And as a broad principle, I agree with that. I don't believe that people should be protesting outside of the law. But if there's going to be proposals to clamp down that, I want to see detail before I'm going to sign up to them. OK,
but Tim, you marched alongside pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. You uploaded a picture and you've since talked about it.
Yes.
You've come under criticism for a 2011 tweet, I'm about to tell you. Go, wait on, tweet where you suggested Occupy Melbourne demonstrators should be water cannoned. Was it hypocritical for you to join Hong Kong protesters? Is it just some protests you like and not others?
No, that's a sort of childish assertion, frankly. People, firstly...
Oh, my God.
Firstly, people have a right to protest, and I have always argued that. That tweet from 2011, I don't want to break it to people, but sometimes people crack jokes on Twitter. Really, obviously, clearly people want to keep re-raising it. They're more than entitled to do so. It doesn't bother me in the slightest.
That wasn't a joke. You were serious.
No, well, sorry, actually... there weren't... It's impossible. I was actually physically there at the time. This is the difference between knowledge and the comments you're making. And Husic, I was actually there at the time. Firstly, there were no water cannons present, just for clarity.
You said bring them out.
And the other part of it is that the Occupy Melbourne protest, by its nature, wasn't just a protest. It was an occupation. This was going all around the world. People had been there for many weeks. And there is a point at which you can't actually just take over public land. Like,
but isn't
you can't
that what's
take over
happened in Hong Kong?
property. Well, no. People are walking through the streets. I mean, where there's violence, that should be condemned, and I condemn it. Where there's physical property destruction, that should be condemned, and I condemn it. But when it comes down to just occupying land in perpetuity because people don't like the outcomes of a democratic process, this is the fundamental difference. In Hong Kong, people are fighting for their right to vote through democratic processes. What this group did at that time was say, we can't achieve what we want to achieve through a democratic process, so we're going to try and subvert it and take over it.
No,
well, I'm sorry,
look,
that is true. That is true.
No,
okay,
no. The Occupy movement was not just about that. I know people have their difference of opinion, Tim Wilson, but Occupy was about, it came out at that point in time where people believed that the way that governments and businesses work together, particularly in the aftermath of the GFC, and the way that the financial system, people weren't held to account for terrible decisions that impacted on ordinary people, while people in very good positions, where people in very good positions weren't held to account. No, and people were going through the Occupy process as a result. We may not agree on it. Hang on a second, you've been rabbiting on.
Let him just finish his sentence.
Let me get clarity on this, Ed. Are you saying you now support occupying a public or private land in perpetuity if people think their cause? It's not about the cause, it's about the process and the method, just like it is with the Extinction
I said
Rebellion.
a few moments ago, people will disagree.
So you disagree?
People will disagree with the way it was done, but what was behind that movement was a concern that people believed that bigger elements, bigger business, those who make bad decisions that impact on ordinary people aren't held to account. And frankly, we're not going to, you tweeted something at that point in time that you were very blasé about and thought you were being very funny about. But the reality is, if anyone else had said that in a way that contradicted your political views, you'd all be uptight about it, and we'd be using all this airtime to defend, you going on and rabbiting on about these things.
I was a private citizen. It was 2011.
All right, 2011. Let's move to what are we in 2019?
A younger, simpler time for Tim Wilson.
Look, I'll just live in the moment for a moment. Why not? Is it appropriate, Tim Wilson, for a coalition MP to actively protest in a domestic political issue in another territory?
Well, I did it as a citizen. I'm not a representative of the government, and yes, I have every right to be able to do so.
All right.
There's no whoops.
Nice line.
That's true.
There as a private citizen. Yeah, okay.
All right, let's just leave it. OK, we're going to move on to another issue because people are talking about this big time today. Ed Husic, what do you make of Ita Buttros's comments this morning? Is the media too white? That's one of the things she said.
Yes.
Tell me Tell me more. Let's explore this idea.
Look, this is an issue I've raised. I guess I'm going to raise private comments that I've raised with senior management of media organisations, and I'll raise them now. And I've raised them with the managing director of the ABC. I think you need to have diverse newsrooms. You need to have a diverse range of people that are presenting that reflect the makeup of the Australian community. We should be rightly proud that we've welcomed to Australian shores people from all parts of the world that have gone on and become great citizens and want to play a part in their community, and reporting on what's happening in the community is one part of that. And I think we should see more of that. And the other thing is too, I think a lot of newsrooms are represented by people that just live in one part of major cities in the country. And I think that's certainly the case in the Sydney area. If you have a lot of journos that lived in electronic or print media that lived west of Strathfield, a large majority of them, I'd be surprised. And it'd be the same in most capital cities. And I do wonder whether or not that has an impact on the news agendas that are set in newsrooms, and we should see more diversity in there, just as I've argued with yourself, not argued, but put the point in discussions that I've had with you, Patricia, about the need for diversity in our parliamentary decision-making fora. We should have the same in media as well. I think it leads to better outcomes.
Tim Wilson, I'd like you to reflect on that, but there's another issue that Ita mentioned this morning. She says Australia has become too politically correct, and perhaps there's been, too much sensitivity, in workplaces and so forth. What do you make of, both those points?
Well, firstly, I agree that it's good to have diversity of opinions. I'm not going to argue that the slightest, and diversity of opinions within the ABC, diversity of people from all different backgrounds that reflect the pluralism of Australia. But I don't actually believe in race-based quotas within an organisation. And I share some of Ita's frustration about the PC culture that does in part sit in Australian society, but some of that also sits against the backdrop of changing cultural norms and standards around workplace harassment and changes in cultural attitudes and norms in that space. But it's also what happens when you have more diversity within society, where it's not a monocultural place. Australia isn't a monocultural place, and doesn't have monocultural workplaces, and so some things that are interpreted one way can be received by others. So I think it's important people are polite, they show respect, and they work with people, but at the same time we've got to have a bit of humour and a bit of larrikinism and recognise that you can't take everything all seriously all the time. What
do you make of that point too, Ed Husic, that we've become too politically correct, or we're losing our larrikinism?
I think there is probably an element of the way in which we get uptight on social media that translates in day-to-day living, I suspect, but I'm not pointing to any evidence-based documentation to be able to back me up on that, but I do think people often wonder whether or not that is happening. I do take on board Tim's point. I'm not arguing for race-based quotas in newsrooms, but if you do make the point with people, they do think about it. And certainly in the conversations that I've had with media organisations where I've made that point, you can tell that people are taking that on board. I made it primarily in the aftermath, if I may say, of Christchurch and the horrific incidents that occurred there, and especially being a lot more mindful about having mainstream media outlets used as a platform for extreme views. While I do take on board that we do need to balance out, and in terms of the points that Tim's made through the course of this contribution today, you need to have a wide range of views being aired, and I totally get that. I just think that sometimes what happens is we don't actually get a breadth of views. We just go straight away to the person who'll have the extreme view because it'll make for more entertaining viewing or might create a drama. And I don't think that does the Australian, in terms of public affairs, doesn't do things, doesn't do a service to that pursuit of ideas.
So the best thing, actually,
just briefly, I need to pause on that because we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I really want to hit some other issues. Tim Wilson, you've been critical of the RBA's interest rate cuts, but they're only doing this because the government is essentially ignoring their calls for more stimulus. They need to do well. You can address this in a moment when I finish my question. Philip Lowe said again today he wants the government to do more. Is there now a push and an impetus for you to do more? Because there's been speculation the RBA governor might look at this issue of quantitative easing as well, and I know you've been concerned about this issue.
Well, it's actually, I just want to make clear that what you just said respectfully is false. What the RBA governor has said is consistently there are three levers to pull. There's monetary policy, fiscal policy and structural reform. Monetary policy has largely been exhausted by interest rate cuts. Fiscal policy, there is already capacity constraints, and the RBA governor has acknowledged this for building new infrastructure because of both state and federal government investment. And in terms of structural reform, we're pushing to lower taxes and to shift the tax base in comparison to, say, the opposition who wanted $387 billion worth of new taxes. You've got to pull all levers, but we're a globally exposed economy. One of the critical things we need to do is keep up that process of structural reform around tax relief, around industrial relations reform, and it's a package deal. It's not a singular thing. And QE is, I think, a deeply concerning measure that the RBA has floated and is socialising. I've made it quite clear that I want to see some compelling evidence, and to be fair to Phil Lowe, he's made it clear that he doesn't believe there's the case for that yet. But if he's going to go down that path, he needs a compelling case because it's a form of intergenerational wealth transfer from the young to the established.
Ed Husic, I want to ask you about an issue I know you've been passionate about, so I've picked the issues that I know that both of you are really focused on. The United States and Australia are negotiating a landmark agreement that would allow each country's law enforcement and security agencies to swiftly access electronic evidence in the other country. Are you comfortable with that arrangement?
Well, I think what needs to be taken on board is the intervention of the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who has written to Peter Dutton saying that those type of data transfer arrangements under the US Cloud Act occur when the US is satisfied that there is a robust protection of privacy and civil rights, and civil liberties, I should say. They have noted, this is the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler has written and said they've noted the concerns raised by a range of tech firms, both here and overseas, plus civil society groups, questioning whether or not the encryption laws that Peter Dutton has forced through Parliament, ignoring the advice of bipartisan parliamentary committees, actually meets those tests. They also rightly raise the adequacy of the judicial oversight and whether or not there are genuine independent judicial oversight mechanisms in place. They don't exist under these laws. That bipartisan committee put forward 17 recommendations triggering 200 amendments. The government made a deal in December saying that they would put those amendments through in February. Peter Dutton ratted on that deal in February. We have flawed law that may prevent us from getting the data that is necessary for national security, and this is all as a result of Peter Dutton playing politics with national security. He's done the wrong thing and he should amend those encryption laws.
I'll give you the final word on that, Tim Wilson. Should there be any amendment to the encryption laws? Are you comfortable with them?
Well, I've raised concerns about them previously. I have. And I'm always looking for ways to improve national security legislation. But on this issue around the cloud, the principal objective that I think both the United States and the Australian government are seeking to achieve in these discussions is what should be dealt with. What should happen online should basically be treated the same as it is if it were physical in its nature around criminal investigations. And I think that's the objective. And so long as we're exploring those objectives, it's utterly consistent. We shouldn't be excluding things simply because they're electronic.
Just very briefly, Ed Husic, just on this issue of troop withdrawal from Syria, the government's still trying to get more information about what the Trump administration is doing. What do you think they should be doing?
Obviously, they've got to get as much information as they can given the sensitivity of what's involved, but, against all sorts of advice, President Donald Trump was advised not to make that unilateral decision on withdrawal. He went ahead and did it. And now there'll be a lot of concern. As I've expressed previously in some of the things that we've been drawn into, I'd be very concerned if we are drawn now into doing something in that part of the world because Donald Trump ignored advice, made a decision rashly, and then we have to go back and sort it out down the track. I'm deeply concerned about the way that decisions are being made by that Trump administration that involve us, And I think, as I've expressed a view previously, that I believe that Donald Trump's more a friend to Donald Trump than he is to Australia, and we should be very careful about making decisions, and we should always prioritise our national interest above becoming, as I've said to yourself on other occasions, Trump toadies just for the sake of keeping him happy.
And Tim Wilson, Republicans are raising concerns about this. Are you concerned?
Well, I guess I've looked at it with curious interest, and I've yet to understand the full motivations behind the decision in the United States. The government's aware of the decision or the position of President Trump and is seeking to I guess probably establish the nature behind it. I think what we all want is for Australia to do what is in its national interest and to work with countries and allies, but in the way that advances our national interest, and that's what I'm focusing on.
I want to end it there. I've got a bit over time, but I really appreciate both of your time this afternoon.
Pleasure.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks,
Thank you.
PK.
Labor's Ed Husic there and Liberal MP Tim